called it kindness, a simple act of mercy in a land that offered none. But in the desolate quiet of the prairie, a single decision to offer comfort spun a thread of fate that would soon unravel into a storm of hoofbeats and shadowed intentions. What began with 3 hungry strangers would, days later, bring dozens to her very door, demanding a reckoning. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The wind was a constant mournful companion to Alara. It moaned around the corners of the weathered clapboard house, whispered through the skeletal remains of the fence posts, and clawed at the scant patch of earth she stubbornly tilled. Each gust was a cold hand against her cheek, a reminder of the vast, indifferent emptiness that stretched to every horizon. 2 years had passed since the fever had claimed Thomas, leaving her here, a solitary sentinel in a world that had no use for lone women. The ranch, once a testament to their shared, arduous dream, had become a monument to her endurance, or perhaps her quiet despair. Her days were a rhythm of brutal labor and profound silence, punctuated only by the creak of the well pump and the distant cry of a hawk. She had built walls around herself, not just of timber and stone, but of a quiet, unyielding resolve. A resolve born from a life that had demanded she constantly rebuild from the rubble of what was lost. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused, scarred maps of a life lived by brute force. Her eyes, once quick to laughter, held a deep, unreadable stillness like a prairie pond reflecting an infinite sky. There was a secret tucked away behind that stillness, a shadow she carried, heavier than any physical burden. It clung to her, a phantom limb of regret and unresolved guilt, staining the edges of her decisions, even the seemingly benevolent ones. Then the speck appeared on the horizon, growing, splitting into 3 distinct forms against the bruised afternoon sky. Horsemen. Her stomach clenched, a familiar primal fear blooming in her chest. Visitors in this land were rarely good tidings. They were often desperate men, hungry men, men who saw a lone woman as an opportunity, a weakness to be exploited. She reached for the old Winchester rifle, its cool metal a familiar comfort against her palm, and moved to the window, watching, her breath held tight. They rode like specters, their horses thin and lathered, their forms hunched against the wind. As they drew closer, she could discern the weariness etched into their very posture, the dust coating their clothes and hair like a second skin. They looked starved, truly, hopelessly starved. One slumped precariously in his saddle, his head lolling. The other 2, gaunt and grim, struggled to keep him upright. Her gaze lingered on their faces, worn and desperate, and something shifted within her. Not pity, not truly, but a calculation, a cold assessment of risk versus something else. A flicker of a memory, perhaps, of a time when the world had offered her no mercy. A time when even a crumb of kindness would have tasted like pure salvation. Or perhaps it was something darker, a perverse curiosity, a challenge to the bleakness that defined her existence. She knew the rules of the prairie. Help meant weakness, but refusing aid could mean an enemy. A gamble, then. Every decision out here was. She lowered the rifle, not out of naive trust, but out of a deeper, more complicated understanding of human desperation. It was a dangerous game, one she had played before in different contexts, with different stakes. As they drew to a halt 100 yards from her gate, their horses blowing, she stepped onto the porch, rifle still within reach. Her silhouette was stark against the fading light, a silent challenge. The 2 conscious men dismounted slowly, their movements stiff, clearly exhausted. One, a man with a heavy beard and eyes that held the weary cunning of a fox, raised a hesitant hand. "Ma'am." His voice was a rasp, like sand on dry wood. "We're lost. Been riding for days. Got a sick man here. Any water? Food?" His eyes, though pleading, held a quick darting appraisal of her, of the house, of the distance to the rifle. She met his gaze, her own a blank wall. There was no warmth in her, only a stark, unwavering presence. She knew the type, the desperate ones were the most dangerous. Her silence stretched, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the wind's howl. It was a test of wills, a silent negotiation of power. Finally she spoke, her voice low, almost a whisper. yet it cut through the wind's lament with surprising force. "There's a well out back, water for your horses, and for him." She gestured towards the slumped figure. "Food, inside. But you step out of line, even an inch, and you'll regret the day you found this place." Her words were not a threat, but a statement of immutable fact, cold and hard as flint. The bearded man's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise cutting through his weariness. He nodded. A single, decisive jerk. He understood. This was not a plea for help, but a proposition, a perilous truce offered by a woman who had clearly learned the harsh grammar of survival. And in that moment, as they led their spent horses towards the well, a seed of dread, cold and sharp, burrowed deep into Alara's gut. She had invited something unknown into her isolated world, and the prairie, she knew, had a cruel way of collecting its debts. The air in the small cabin grew thick with the smell of sweat, damp earth, and boiling coffee. Alara watched them, three shadows in the dim light of the lamp, their gaunt faces illuminated by the flickering flames of the stove. The sick man, a youth barely out of boyhood, lay bundled in blankets on the floor, his breathing shallow, punctuated by ragged coughs. His companions, two men whose faces were etched with the weariness of endless miles and unforgiving sun, ate in ravenous silence. Their movements were slow, deliberate, the simple act of chewing seeming to require immense effort. She had placed the food on the rough-hewn table, a stew, thick with what little dried meat and vegetables she possessed, and slabs of sourdough bread. It was not charity she offered, not truly. It was a transaction, a weighing of unpredictable scales. She had watched them closely, assessing their intentions, their desperation. The bearded man, who called himself Silas, had a quiet intensity, his eyes missing nothing, even as he devoured the meager meal. The other, younger, with a nervous twitch in his eye, was named Jeb. He glanced at her often, a mixture of wariness and something akin to awe in his gaze, as if she were a ghost in the vast, empty land. She did not ask questions. Questions often invited lies or worse, truths too dangerous to hear. Their story, simple and brief, had been that they were riders, separated from their outfit by a sudden dust storm, now hopelessly lost. It was plausible enough, yet she knew the prairie too well to simply accept words at face value. The fire crackled, its warmth a stark contrast to the biting wind outside. Silas, having finished his meal, pushed the empty plate away with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 100 miles. "You saved us, ma'am," he rasped, his voice a little stronger now. "No one else for miles. We thought we were done for." His gaze was steady, but there was a flicker of something in its depths, a hidden calculation that Alara noted, a subtle shift in his expression that suggested a practiced ease with deception. She remained silent, pouring herself a cup of the bitter coffee, her movements economical, deliberate. She did not believe in simple acts of salvation, not in this world. Every rescue came with an unspoken price, a tangled web of obligations or unforeseen consequences. She was not a savior. She was a survivor. She had lived long enough to understand that even the most benign gestures could become snares. Her own history was testament to that, a complex tapestry of choices made under duress, some righteous, some far less so, all born from the bitter necessity of staying alive. The memory of her husband, Thomas, flashed across her mind, not a comforting presence, but a phantom of regret. He had been a man of simple goodness, a quality that had ultimately proven to be his undoing in this unforgiving landscape. She had learned from his mistakes, hardening herself against the softness that could lead to ruin. The night wore on, punctuated by the labored breathing of the sick cowboy. Alara sat by the window, the rifle across her lap, watching the inky blackness beyond the glass. The silence was not truly empty. It hummed with unspoken words, with the weight of her choice, with the uncertainty of morning. She had offered them shelter, but she offered no trust. Her sleep, when it finally came, was light and restless, haunted by images of pursuit and capture, old fears rising to the surface like specters from a long-buried past. The image of the dozens in the title, not yet real, already began to cast a shadow over her mind, an unbidden premonition of the chaos she had unwittingly invited. She rose before dawn, the first pale light barely touching the eastern sky, and stoked the fire. The cowboy stirred, stretching stiffly. The young, sick one was still weak, but his breathing was steadier. "He needs more time, ma'am," Silas said, his voice flat. "He's not fit to ride." Alara looked at the boy, then at Silas. Another complication. This wasn't a quick stop, a fleeting moment of contact. This was an extension, a deeper entanglement, a slow burn, just as she had anticipated, or feared. The thought of them staying, even for a day, made her skin crawl. Her solitude was her shield, her only true protection. To break it, even for an act of necessary kindness, felt like stripping away a layer of her own skin. She watched them closely as they moved about the small space, their movements a stark contrast to the quiet, almost reverent way Thomas used to navigate their home. These men were frontiersmen, yes, but not like him. There was a raw edge to them, a predatory awareness that vibrated just beneath their surface exhaustion. Silas was the leader, his quiet authority undeniable. He spoke little, but his eyes missed nothing. He was observing her, just as she was observing him. A silent, deadly chess match played out over cups of bitter coffee. The thought of their departure, when it eventually came, was not one of relief, but of amplified suspense. What had they seen? What had they taken in? What stories would they carry with them, stories that might lead others here? This thought, like a burrowing worm, began to gnaw at her. The isolation she cherished, the solitude that had been her refuge, now felt like a fragile veil, easily torn. She had always been careful, meticulous in maintaining the illusion of emptiness around her, of nothing worth finding. But now, 3 men, strangers, had walked directly into her world, and their presence, no matter how brief, had already changed its fabric. The young cowboy, the one named Billy, was slowly regaining strength, his eyes now open, though clouded with fever. He coughed, a wet rattling sound, and she found herself offering him a small cup of weak tea, a gesture born less of compassion and more of a desire to see them gone, quickly and without further complications. The days stretched, marked only by the shifting light and the slow consumption of her dwindling supplies. Each meal shared, each word spoken, was a small erosion of her carefully constructed defenses. The quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere within the cabin was more unsettling than any overt threat. The cowboys, now regaining their strength, began to move with a latent energy, their eyes sharper, their presence more substantial. Silas would often stare out the window, his gaze fixed on the endless horizon, a silent surveyor of the land. Alara knew he wasn't simply admiring the view. He was assessing, calculating, mapping the landscape in his mind. What he was mapping, she couldn't be sure, but a cold dread told her it was something related to her, to this place. Jeb, the younger, nervous one, was less subtle. He would often watch Alara, a curious, almost fearful fascination in his eyes. Sometimes he'd try to make small talk, his words awkward, hesitant, but she would offer only terse, practical replies, drawing him back to her carefully constructed boundaries. Her reticence was a wall, and she had built it high and thick over the years. She knew that vulnerability was a luxury she could not afford, not after everything. The details of her past, the true reason for her isolated existence, remained locked away, a guarded secret far more precious than any physical possession. It was a fragile thing, this fragile piece she had forged for herself, and these men, simply by their presence, were disturbing its delicate balance. She would catch Silas watching her, a speculative glint in his eyes, as if he were trying to read the unwritten chapters of her life. He seemed to sense the deep vein of hidden pain she carried, the scars not visible to the naked eye, but etched into the very core of her being. One afternoon, as Alara was tending to the last of her chickens, a task that grounded her in the brutal reality of her existence, Silas approached her. The wind whipped at his clothes, making him appear even more gaunt and angular. "Ma'am," he began, his voice low, "we've been a burden. We appreciate your kindness." Kindness. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. She had offered a practical transaction, not kindness. "You were stranded," she stated, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "It's the way out here." He nodded, but his eyes held hers, unwavering. Most wouldn't have bothered, not with no kin around to ask questions. It was a probing statement, a subtle push against her carefully guarded privacy. He knew, or at least suspected, she was truly alone. He was testing her, trying to gauge the depth of her isolation, the extent of her vulnerability. Her jaw tightened, but she kept her face impassive. "No kin needed to tell me the right way to act," she replied, her voice sharper than she intended. A lie. There had been kin once, and a right way to act once. But that had been long ago, in a different life, before the prairie had stripped her bare of such luxuries. Silas merely grunted, a sound that could have been agreement or skepticism. He let the subject drop, but the seed of his inquiry had been planted. Days bled into a week. Billy, the young cowboy, was finally able to sit up, though he was still pale and weak. The endless plains around them seemed to stretch further, vast and silent, as if holding its breath. Ilara felt it, the escalating tension, a silent, almost imperceptible hum in the air. Their presence was a constant drain, not just on her provisions, but on her very spirit. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the thin walls of her home could no longer protect her from the outside world. She would lie awake at night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the men's breathing in the next room, her hand instinctively reaching for the cold steel of the rifle. The dreams came then, fragmented images of a past she had tried so desperately to bury. A flickering lamp in a small, dusty town. A heated argument, hushed voices growing louder. A sudden, terrible noise. A man's face, contorted in fear. Then something else, a desperate final understanding. And her standing amidst it all, an unwitting participant or perhaps something more. The details were always hazy, just out of reach, but the emotions were sharp. Fear, regret, and a profound, bone-deep sorrow. These dreams were not a release, but a tightening of the knot in her stomach, a physical manifestation of the moral ambiguity that clung to her like a shroud. She was not a simple, benevolent widow. She was a woman shaped by difficult choices, some made under duress, some chosen out of a grim necessity, choices that had left indelible marks on her soul. "We need to go, ma'am," Silas announced one morning, his voice firm, decisive. Billy was standing now, leaning against the wall, but his color was still poor. Jeb stood behind Silas, his eyes darting between Ilara and the door. A flicker of relief, cold and sharp, cut through Ilara's apprehension. They were leaving. The silence would return. Her solitude would be restored. But then, another thought, a chilling premonition, washed over her. Their departure was not an ending, but a new beginning of uncertainty. What had they gleaned from their stay? What had they seen in her sparse home, in her guarded demeanor, in the very land around her? The questions hung unspoken in the air, a heavier presence than the men themselves. She simply nodded, her face unreadable. Safe travels. The words felt hollow, a meaningless formality in a land where safety was a fleeting illusion. They packed their meager belongings, gathered their horses from the small corral. Silas approached her one last time, a small, worn leather pouch in his hand. "For your trouble, ma'am." He extended it, his eyes once again holding that strange, calculating glint. She did not reach for it. "No need," she stated, her voice flat. She wanted nothing from them, no ties, no obligations, no lingering connection. His hand remained outstretched, then slowly he lowered it, a slight frown creasing his brow. "As you wish." He gave her a final, appraising look, a look that lingered, as if trying to commit every detail of her, of the house, to memory. Jeb, true to his nervous nature, gave her a quick, almost apologetic nod before mounting his horse. Billy, still weak, managed a faint, grateful smile. He was the only one who seemed to harbor genuine, unburdened gratitude. Silas swung into his saddle, his movements fluid, belying his earlier exhaustion. He reined his horse around, turning its head east towards the distant, hazy mountains. For a moment he paused, his gaze sweeping over the ranch, over Ilara standing on the porch, a lone, stark figure against the vastness. It was a possessive look, a look that suggested he had taken something from her, not of value, but of information, a secret gleaned from her isolation. Then, with a curt nod that was less a farewell and more a dismissal, he spurred his horse forward. Jeb and Billy followed, their forms quickly diminishing against the immense canvas of the prairie. The dust they kicked up hung in the air long after they were gone, a lingering cloud, a silent testament to their fleeting yet impactful presence. Ilara stood there watching until they were nothing more than 3 vanishing specks, swallowed by the horizon. The silence descended once more, but it was different now. It was no longer a comforting blanket, but a hollow echo, pregnant with unspoken possibilities. Her world, once hermetically sealed, had been breached, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the ripple effects of this breach were only just beginning. The wind, which had been her constant companion, now seemed to whisper a new warning, a low, ominous hum that spoke of a gathering storm. Her hand tightened on the weathered railing, her knuckles white. She had fed 3 stranded cowboys, but what had she truly set in motion? The memory of the dozens from the title pulsed in her mind, a premonition now sharper, more terrifyingly real. The days that followed were a torturous, slow unfolding of quiet dread. The silence of the prairie, once a solace, now felt heavy, suffocating. Each rustle of dry grass, each distant cry of a coyote, made Ilara flinch, her senses hyper-alert, straining for the telltale sound of approaching horses. She found herself scanning the horizon constantly, her gaze sweeping the empty expanse, searching for the first hint of dust, the first sign of riders. Sleep became an elusive ghost, haunted by fragmented nightmares and the chilling certainty that her peace was irrevocably broken. The memory of Silas's calculating gaze, his probing questions about her lack of kin, replayed in her mind, a broken record of impending doom. He hadn't asked for much, hadn't seen much of material value. So what was it? What had he gleaned that would bring dozens to her doorstep? The mystery gnawed at her, fueling her growing anxiety. It was not a physical threat she feared most. Not yet. It was the violation of her solitude, the unraveling of the quiet life she had so painstakingly built in the wake of Thomas's death. The land, once her refuge, now felt like a vast, exposed stage, and she, the solitary actor, awaiting an audience she desperately wished to avoid. Her daily chores, once a grounding routine, now felt like a desperate attempt to maintain an illusion of normalcy. She fed the chickens, watered her small garden, mended fences, each action carried out with a grim determination, a refusal to surrender to the mounting fear. But her movements were stiff, her thoughts consumed by the unspoken threat. She found herself returning often to the few pieces of furniture that remained from Thomas's life, running her calloused fingers over the smooth, worn wood. Not out of nostalgia, but out of a desperate need to feel something solid, something immutable, in a world that felt increasingly volatile. A particular oak chest, heavy and dark, drew her gaze repeatedly. It sat in the corner of the small sleeping room, a silent, imposing sentinel. It held not clothes or blankets, but the remnants of her past, the tangible evidence of decisions made long ago, decisions that had shaped her present, her isolation, and perhaps were now drawing this impending storm to her door. It was a Pandora's box, a silent repository of her deepest flaws and the moral ambiguities that defined her. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to pack what she could, and disappear into the vastness, to become another ghost in the endless plains. But where would she go? This land, harsh as it was all she had ever known, all she had ever fought for, and a part of her, the stubborn, unyielding part, refused to be driven from her own home. She had survived worse, she told herself, clutching at the frayed edges of her defiance. One afternoon, a week after the Cowboys had left, the air shimmered with an unusual stillness. The wind died down, the sky turned a strange, bruised purple, and an ominous quiet settled over the prairie. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a storm, a silence so profound it felt like a scream held back. Ilara was outside, gathering firewood when she felt it, a faint vibration in the earth, a rhythmic thrumming that grew steadily, ominously louder. Her blood ran cold. Hoofbeats. Not 3, not 4, many, too many. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She dropped the firewood, the sound startlingly loud in the oppressive silence. She scrambled towards the house, her gaze fixed on the horizon, dread coiling in her stomach. And then she saw them. Not a speck, but a cloud of dust, rising like a dark plume against the bruised sky. And within that cloud, dozens of figures, horses and riders, a dark, churning mass moving with relentless purpose towards her ranch. The sight was visceral, a punch to the gut. The world seemed to narrow, the vast prairie collapsing around her. The silent dread had found its terrifying voice. This was it, the reckoning, the price for her kindness, or perhaps the consequence of a past she could no longer outrun. The roar of hoofbeats grew into a thunder, shaking the very foundations of her small world. Dust, thick and choking, billowed up from the approaching horde, a swirling, suffocating curtain that heralded their arrival. Ilara stood on the porch, the old Winchester held steady in her trembling hands, her knuckles white, her breath shallow. Her mind raced, a frantic kaleidoscope of memories and calculations. How many? What did they want? Was it the cattle Thomas had managed to acquire, or the meager stash of supplies she kept? Or was it something else, something far more sinister, connected to the ghosts that whispered from her own shadowed past? The fear was a cold, constricting band around her chest, but beneath it, a stubborn, bitter defiance stirred. She would not flee. She would not surrender. This land, this house, was all she had left, and she would defend it with the last ounce of her strength, even if it meant her own undoing. Her eyes scanned the approaching mass, trying to pick out familiar faces, but they were too many, a faceless, intimidating wave. The lead riders were closer now, their faces grim, their clothes dust-caked, their weapons glinting dully in the fading light. There was no casualness in their approach, no friendly wave. This was an invasion. They fanned out, surrounding the house, their movements precise, practiced. Horses snorted, bits jingled, and the creak of leather filled the air, a cacophony that obliterated the prairie's usual silence. The stench of horse sweat and unwashed men was suddenly overwhelming. Ilara counted them, her gaze sweeping from one hard-faced figure to the next. 20, 30, perhaps more. A veritable army. And then, her eyes landed on a familiar figure, sitting atop a powerful black horse at the head of the group. Silas. His face was grim, his eyes narrowed, devoid of the earlier weariness or the calculated glint she remembered. Now, they held a stark, uncompromising purpose. He dismounted slowly, his gaze fixed on her, an unspoken question hanging in the air between them. He had led them here. He had betrayed her, not out of malice, perhaps, but out of some deeper, unknown agenda. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. She had offered solace, and in return he had brought an army. The air was thick with tension, palpable, suffocating. Not a single word was spoken, yet the air vibrated with unspoken threats, with the weight of impending conflict. "Ilara!" a voice boomed, cutting through the heavy silence. It was not Silas. It was a man dismounting from a horse behind him, a burly figure with a cruel set to his jaw and a badge pinned to his dusty vest. A lawman. Her heart sank. This wasn't about a simple robbery or even a dispute over land. This was official. This was judgment. The law had come to her doorstep, dragged here by the very men she had offered succor. "Ilara Thorne," the man repeated, his voice echoing across the silent yard. "We have a warrant for your arrest." The words hung in the air, cold and definitive. Arrest? For what? Her mind reeled, grasping at straws, desperately trying to understand. Had Silas in his travels somehow connected her to that distant, buried past, the one she had tried so hard to escape? Had he been seeking something specific, something she unknowingly possessed or represented? The thought was a sickening plunge into an abyss of fear and confusion. The rifle, heavy in her hands, felt suddenly useless against such numbers, against the weight of the law. She could fight, yes. She could perhaps take a few down with her. But against this many? And against the law, however corrupt or misguided it might be, it was a futile gesture, a suicide. Her gaze flickered to the old oak chest inside the house, the silent witness to her darkest secrets. Had it finally been discovered? Was the truth she had guarded so fiercely, about to be dragged into the brutal light of day? The lawman, Sheriff Bowman, approached slowly, his boots crunching on the dry earth. His eyes, hard and unwavering, swept over her, taking in her worn clothes, the rifle, the defenselessness of her isolated ranch. Silas stood silently beside him, a grim shadow, his presence a stark reminder of her unwitting role in this unfolding drama. "Murder," Bowman stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, a judge already convinced. "For the murder of Thomas Thorne." The word struck Alara like a physical blow. Thomas, her husband, the man she had mourned, the man whose ghost still haunted her quiet moments. Murder? The accusation was absurd, monstrous. Her initial shock gave way to a surge of cold fury, a defensive fire that ignited deep within her. "That's a lie," she spat, her voice raw, unfamiliar even to herself. "He died of fever. Everyone knows that." Bowman merely sneered, a cruel twist of his lips. "The story changes, ma'am. We have new information. Information provided by certain parties who found you remarkably quiet about certain inconsistencies." His gaze flickered to Silas, a subtle acknowledgement of the cowboy's role. Silas remained expressionless, a silent betrayer. The crowd of cowboys murmured, a low, guttural hum that was both accusatory and curious. Stereotypical figures indeed. They represented the swift, brutal judgment of the frontier, where whispers could become truth and suspicion, condemnation. Alara felt their eyes on her, stripping her bare, judging her, seeing her not as a grieving widow but as a treacherous killer. The truth was a complex, tangled thing, not a simple black and white. Her relationship with Thomas had been fraught, their marriage burdened by secrets and the harsh realities of their life on the frontier. His death had been sudden, devastating, but not at her hand. Or had it? A fleeting, unwelcome memory of a specific argument, a moment of desperation, a desperate impulse, flashed through her mind, quickly suppressed. She had always convinced herself otherwise, but the seeds of doubt, once planted, were hard to uproot. The moral ambiguity of her character, her deep flaws, were now laid bare under the harsh scrutiny of these judging eyes. This accusation, however false, had tapped into the very core of her insecurities, her past decisions, the unspoken guilt she had carried for so long. "You're making a mistake, Sheriff," Alara insisted, her voice trembling despite her efforts to control it. "I had no reason. I loved my husband." Another lie, or at least a partial truth. Love in their life had been a concept constantly challenged by hardship, by unspoken disappointments, by the weight of expectations. She had loved him, yes, in her own way, but their bond had been strained, fractured by the very isolation that now defined her existence. Bowman took another step closer, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "The evidence suggests otherwise, ma'am. A certain amount of gold missing from your husband's personal effects, a sudden and rather convenient death, followed by your refusal to sell the ranch and disappear, as many widows would." He paused, his eyes drilling into hers. "And the story of a certain stranger seen arguing with Thomas Thorne shortly before his demise, a stranger that has now resurfaced, telling a very different tale. A stranger. Her blood ran cold. He meant him. The other man, the one she had tried so desperately to forget, the one who had been linked to her past, to the secret in the oak chest. So, this was the secret Silas had uncovered. This was the dark thread that connected her to a past she had tried to sever. Not that she killed Thomas, but that someone else had, and she had known, had perhaps even been complicit in its concealment. The true moral ambiguity of her situation was finally brought to light. A gasp went through the crowd. The accusation of a missing gold and a mysterious stranger added a layer of intrigue, a narrative far more dramatic and compelling than a simple fever. The men, their faces grim, exchanged glances. Alara's mind raced, struggling to reconcile this fabricated narrative with the complex, painful truth. Gold? There was no gold. Not from Thomas. The stranger. He was the key. He was the open loop from her past, a terrifying thread that now connected her to this present nightmare. She had hoped he was dead, or simply forgotten. But the world, it seemed, had a cruel way of bringing the past back to haunt the present, particularly when a seemingly random act of kindness opened the door to such investigations. Her breath hitched. The truth, stripped of its layers of self-deception and rationalization, was a bitter pill to swallow. Thomas had died of fever, yes, but there had been a stranger, and there had been gold. Not from Thomas, but from a past she had desperately tried to bury, a past that had intersected violently with her life on the ranch. It was the source of her original flaw, the moral ambiguity she carried, the weight of her secrecy. "This is a desperate lie," Ilara cried out, her voice cracking. Her gaze swept over the crowd, seeking any sign of understanding, any flicker of doubt. There was none, only hard eyes, judgmental stares. They saw a woman accused, and in their minds that was as good as convicted. Bowman smiled, a cold, humorless expression. "The truth often finds a way, ma'am. You'll come with us." He took another step forward, hand still on his pistol. The tension stretched, thin and brittle like old parchment. A single spark, a single wrong move, and it would all explode. Ilara clutched the rifle, her mind a whirlwind of choices. Fight and die, leaving her reputation shattered and her truth forever untold. Or surrender, and face a trial she knew would be a sham, a spectacle designed to condemn her regardless of innocence. The weight of the moment was crushing. This was not just about her freedom, it was about her legacy, the story of her life. And if she allowed them to write it, it would be a story of a murderous widow, a twisted, perverse narrative far from the convoluted reality. She looked at Silas, her betrayer. His face was still impassive, but his eyes for a fleeting moment held a strange, almost sorrowful depth. He hadn't known the full truth, perhaps, only fragments, pieces he had stitched together, or had been fed by others, to create this damning tapestry. Or perhaps he did know, and this was his twisted form of justice. "No," Ilara whispered, the word a defiance, a challenge against the overwhelming odds. "I won't go." It was not a battle she expected to win, but a stand she felt compelled to make, a desperate refusal to let them simply take her and rewrite her narrative. The crowd stirred, a collective intake of breath. Bowman's face hardened, his hand tightening on his weapon. "Don't be a fool, woman. You're outnumbered. You have no chance." He was right, of course. She knew it. The logical part of her mind screamed at her to surrender, to fight another day in a courtroom, however unjust. But another part, the primal, unyielding part, refused. She was a woman who had lived by her own rules, however dark or unconventional. She had faced down drought, sickness, loneliness, and the relentless indifference of the land. She would not be taken quietly. The sun, sinking rapidly, cast long, distorted shadows across the yard, turning the figures of the cowboys into monstrous, faceless shapes. The wind began to pick up again, a low, mournful howl, echoing the turmoil within her. This pivotal moment, this confrontation, was not just about the accusation of murder. It was about her very identity, forged in the crucible of hardship and shadowed by a past she could not escape. It was about the choices she had made, the secrets she had kept, and the ultimate bitter irony of her act of kindness bringing her to this precipice. "There's more to this," Ilara stated, her voice surprisingly steady now, a profound calm settling over her as she met Bowman's unwavering gaze. The decision had been made, the path chosen. She wouldn't just surrender, she would fight, not with bullets, but with words, with the desperate, raw truth she had kept hidden. The gold. It wasn't Thomas's. It was mine. From a different life. A life I ran from. To protect myself. And to protect him. Her gaze flickered to Silas. A silent accusation. "That stranger you speak of. He wasn't just a stranger. He was a ghost from that life. A shadow of my past. And he came for that gold. Not for Thomas." A ripple went through the crowd. A collective shift of attention. The narrative was changing, becoming more complex, more intriguing. It was no longer a simple tale of a wicked widow, but a story of hidden wealth, a dangerous past, and a different kind of threat. Bowman frowned, his certainty wavering slightly. "What are you talking about, woman?" he demanded, though a flicker of curiosity, or perhaps genuine surprise, crossed his features. Ilara took a deep breath, the bitter prairie dust filling her lungs. This was it, the strategic reveal. The opening of the open loop. "His name was Elias," she began, her voice gaining strength, echoing across the tense yard. "He was a partner in a venture back east, a venture that went terribly wrong. Money was lost, lives were lost, and I took what was left to escape. to make a new life. Thomas knew nothing of it. He was a good man, too trusting for this world. The words poured out of her, raw and unvarnished. A torrent of truth she had kept bottled up for years. The details of her past, the shadowy, morally ambiguous origins of her wealth, were finally exposed. It was a gamble, a desperate plea for understanding against the tide of accusation. The crowd was silent, rapt. This was far more dramatic than they had anticipated. Bowman's eyes narrowed, his skepticism battling with the compelling nature of her confession. "And this Elias? What happened to him?" His voice was sharp, cutting. Ilara met his gaze, her own reflecting the darkness of the past she was now unveiling. "He found me. He came here, demanding his share. He threatened Thomas. He threatened me. There was a fight. Thomas, he had the fever bad, he was weak. Elias, he was a violent man. He hit Thomas, he knocked him unconscious. And then he saw the gold, my gold. He took it, and then he ran." Her voice trembled on the last words, the memory fresh and agonizing. This was the truth she had lived with, the guilt she had carried. Not that she killed Thomas, but that her past, her choices, had brought Elias to their door, and that his violence, combined with Thomas's fever-weakened state, had ultimately led to her husband's demise. She had not killed him, but she hadn't protected him either, not fully. This was the emotional climax, the raw confession of her moral ambiguity. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Silas, who had been silent, shifted, his eyes fixed on Ilara, a complex mix of understanding and regret on his face. He had clearly only known fragments, enough to bring the law, but not the full, agonizing truth. He had been a tool, an unwitting catalyst for this painful revelation. "He's the murderer," Ilara continued, her voice rising, filled with a desperate conviction. "Elias, not me. He was the one who left Thomas for dead, weakened by fever after he'd taken my gold. I found him later, unresponsive. He died that night. The fever claimed him, yes, but Elias's blows hastened it. I knew no one would believe me. A woman with a past, with hidden gold. I buried the gold he couldn't carry, and I buried the truth with it. Until now." Her eyes, once still, now burned with a fierce, desperate light. She was not asking for mercy. She was demanding justice, demanding that the true villain be known. The story, once a simple accusation, had unraveled into a complex tapestry of crime, passion, and hidden pasts. The men around them, once a unified front of judgment, now looked at each other, doubt clouding their faces. They were beginning to see the woman not as a simple stereotype, but as a deeply flawed, emotionally complex individual, caught in a web of circumstances far beyond their initial comprehension. Sheriff Bowman, his face a mask of disbelief, was visibly shaken by the raw emotion and unexpected depth of her confession. He looked at Silas, a silent question in his eyes. Silas, in turn, met Ilara's gaze, a profound sense of regret etched into his features. He had come across Elias somewhere on the trail, heard a twisted version of events, perhaps even witnessed evidence of the stolen gold, and brought the story to the sheriff, believing he was uncovering a simple truth. But he had been misled, a pawn in Elias's malicious scheme. The silence that followed Ilara's revelation was heavy, broken only by the snorting of horses and the restless shuffling of the men. It was a silence filled with shifting perspectives, with the painful reevaluation of judgment. Bowman slowly removed his hand from his pistol, the gesture small, almost imperceptible, but a significant sign of his wavering certainty. "You're saying this, Elias? He framed you?" he finally managed, his voice low, his eyes still studying her face, searching for any sign of deceit. Ilara nodded, her gaze firm, unyielding. "He wanted my gold, and he wanted to cover his tracks. He knew I'd be blamed. A lone woman, easily dismissed. She wasn't asking for pity, but for the recognition of a larger, more insidious truth. The narrative had flipped. The kindness to Silas had not brought her to this reckoning, but rather Silas's subsequent investigation had brought the real perpetrator's story to light, albeit in a twisted form. "Where is this Elias now?" Bowman demanded, his voice gaining a new edge, one of genuine investigative purpose rather than condemnation. Ilara looked away for a moment, her gaze sweeping over the vast, indifferent landscape. "He headed west," she said, her voice heavy. "He was injured. I saw him fall from his horse, far out on the plains. I thought he was gone, but he must have survived." Her words held a fresh agony, the realization that her tormentor was not only alive but had actively sought to destroy her. The symbolism was stark. A past she thought dead, now resurrected to haunt her. The tension in the yard had transformed, from accusation to intrigue, from judgment to a grim determination to uncover the true facts. The faces of the cowboys, once hard and judgmental, now held a mixture of curiosity and a nascent sense of injustice. They had been part of a mob, ready to condemn based on circumstantial evidence, and now the rug had been pulled out from under their collective certainty. Silas stepped forward, a palpable tension radiating from him. "Sheriff," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I told you what I heard, what I saw. Elias, he was bragging in a saloon down south, showing off gold, talking about a widow and a stupid old man he'd taken care of. I thought he meant her." He gestured to Alara. "I had no idea he was twisting the knife like this." He was a witness, a flawed one, but a necessary one. His earlier stoicism had given way to a stark admission of his own misjudgment, his regret palpable in the sudden vulnerability of his expression. Bowman nodded, his gaze now fixed on Silas. The pieces were starting to fit, not into the initial narrative of murder, but into a much darker, more insidious plot. The tension slowly diffused, replaced by a grim resolve. The dozens had come for judgment, but they had found a complex truth, a call for actual justice. Ilara slowly lowered the rifle, her arms aching, her entire body trembling with the aftershocks of the revelation. The danger had not passed, but it had shifted from a personal condemnation to a shared pursuit of a true criminal. The hopeful resolution hinted at in the profile was beginning to emerge, not as a sudden burst of sunshine, but as a slow, arduous climb out of a deep, dark valley. The dramatic storytelling had found its emotional climax, a pivot point where accusation transformed into understanding, and the possibility of redemption, or at least justice, began to bloom in the harsh prairie dust. The path ahead was still fraught with peril, but she would no longer walk it alone, shadowed by the burden of a lie. The common device of an open loop, her past, had now been tragically, dramatically closed, revealing a new, equally dangerous path. Sheriff Bowman, now convinced of a far more intricate and sinister plot, turned to his men. His voice, once accusatory, now carried the sharp, decisive tone of a man on a hunt. "Spread out, search the area. This Elias couldn't have gone far, and keep an eye out for any sign of that gold." The shift was immediate, palpable. The dozens of riders who had arrived as a condemning mob now transformed into a posse, their purpose redefined. The tension, though still present, had morphed from internal conflict to external pursuit. Ilara watched them disperse, a strange mix of relief and renewed apprehension washing over her. The immediate threat of false imprisonment was lifted, but a new, more dangerous one had taken its place. Elias was still out there, a ghost from her past, now actively seeking her ruin. Her life, once defined by isolation, was now undeniably, inextricably linked to the wider, more chaotic world. She was no longer a silent sentinel, but a central figure in a dangerous, unfolding drama. Silas approached her, his hat in his hands, his head bowed. "Ma'am," he began, his voice low, filled with shame. "I was wrong. I believed his lies. I brought this down on you. I'm sorry." His apology was genuine, raw, reflecting the ground truth of the moment. He was a flawed character like her, driven by his own perceptions and limited understanding. Ilara looked at him, her gaze unwavering. The bitterness was still there, a hard knot in her stomach, but beneath it a sliver of something akin to understanding. He had been a catalyst, yes, but not a malicious one. "It's the prairie, Silas," she said, her voice quiet. "It brings out the worst in men and twists the truth till it's unrecognizable. You merely saw what you were shown. It wasn't forgiveness, not truly, but a statement of their shared reality, the harsh grammar of this unforgiving land. The narrative had shifted. The victim was now clearly Ilara, and the prey, Elias. The moral ambiguity of her own past, though exposed, had been tempered by the stark reality of Elias's villainy. The common devices of irony and symbolism were at play here. The act of kindness had indeed brought dozens to her door, but not for the reason she, or they, had initially assumed. It had brought them for justice, albeit a circuitous, painful route. The wind, which had howled a warning of her impending doom, now seemed to carry a different song, a low, mournful tune that spoke of the chase, the pursuit of truth. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red, a dramatic backdrop to the shifting alliances and renewed purpose. The posse had fanned out across the plains, their figures disappearing into the deepening twilight, a symbolic pursuit of the shadows of the past. Ilara stood on the porch, the rifle still in her hands. Though no longer raised in defiance, but held with a quiet, grounded strength, she felt exposed, vulnerable, yet paradoxically, lighter. The heavy burden of her secret, the guilt of the past, had been lifted, laid bare under the harsh light of the prairie sun. The resolution was not one of immediate peace, but of a new beginning, a path forward towards a true, if difficult, reckoning. She knew the days and weeks ahead would be fraught with danger, with the looming threat of Elias, and the lingering suspicion of a frontier justice system that was often quick to judge. But she would face it, not as a condemned woman, but as a survivor fighting for her truth. The visual cues of the setting sun, the darkening sky, provided a subtle yet clear scene transition, leading towards the tense, uncertain future. Days blurred into a tense, agonizing wait. The posse had returned empty-handed, their faces grim, their pursuit of Elias proving futile. The prairie was vast, unforgiving, and the law, even with dozens of men, struggled to pin down a desperate fugitive. The news brought a fresh wave of despair to Ilara, a chilling realization that Elias was still out there, a living embodiment of her past, a constant threat hanging over her. Sheriff Bowman, however, had seemed to accept her story, albeit with a lingering caution in his eyes. He had offered a tacit understanding, a grim acknowledgement that the truth, when it finally emerged, was often far more complicated than initially presumed. He had left a few deputies behind, a small, visible symbol of protection, but also a constant reminder of the watchful eyes of the law. Their presence was a double-edged sword, a shield against the unknown, but also an intrusion on her cherished solitude. The rhythm of her days, once broken by the initial invasion, now settled into a new, anxious pattern. She continued her chores, but her senses remained acutely attuned to every sound, every shadow, every shift in the wind. Silas, to her surprise, had not left with the main body of the posse. He remained a silent, brooding presence, his presence a complex mix of guilt and a strange, quiet commitment. He would often watch her from a distance, his gaze somber, as if grappling with the weight of his unwitting betrayal. One afternoon he approached her, a raw honesty in his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, his voice hesitant, I feel responsible. I want to help you find him, make it right." Ilara looked at him, surprised by his unexpected offer. Her initial instinct was to refuse, to send him away, to rebuild her walls. But something in his sincerity, in his genuine regret, resonated with a part of her that had long been dormant, a part that yearned for something beyond her solitary existence. "You don't owe me anything, Silas," she stated, her voice flat, but without the harshness it had once held. "This isn't your fight." He shook his head slowly. "Maybe not, but it feels like it. I brought it to your door. I can help take it away." The common device of irony. The man who brought the storm now sought to help calm it. His character, initially a stereotypical societal figure, was slowly revealing layers of complexity, moving beyond the simple betrayer archetype. Her gaze swept over the harsh, beautiful landscape. The threat of Elias remained, a venomous snake coiled in the shadows. She knew that the deputies, however well-intentioned, were not enough. She needed someone who understood the land, someone who understood the way men like Elias thought, someone who could see beyond the immediate, into the deeper currents of the prairie. And Silas, for all his flaws, possessed that knowledge. The decision weighed heavily on her. To accept his help was to open herself further, to forge an alliance with a man who had, however unknowingly, nearly destroyed her. It was a step into the unknown, a breach of her carefully constructed isolation, yet the alternative was to remain a solitary target, forever looking over her shoulder. This was the moral ambiguity of her present dilemma: trust a man who had wronged her, or face the greater evil alone. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions, with the weight of her choice. The wind, a constant presence, seemed to hold its breath, awaiting her answer. This slow-burn pacing intensified the emotional gravity of the moment, building tension through the unspoken decision. Finally, Alara exhaled, a long, weary sigh that carried the weight of her years. "He won't be easy to find, Silas," she said, her voice low, resigned. "He's cunning and dangerous." It wasn't a yes, not explicitly, but an acknowledgement of the grim reality and a tacit acceptance of his offer. Silas's face brightened, a flicker of grim determination replacing the guilt. "I know this land, ma'am," he stated, his gaze meeting hers, "and I know men like him. He'll make a mistake. They always do." And in that moment, a fragile, unspoken truce was forged between them. A woman scarred by her past, and a man seeking to atone for his unwitting role in her suffering, united by the shared pursuit of a dangerous truth. The hopeful resolution, once a distant glimmer, now felt a little closer, born not from a magical rescue, but from the gritty, grounded reality of a shared burden. The path ahead was still fraught with peril, a journey through the dark, tense, unforgiving landscape, but Alara would no longer walk it entirely alone. The visual metaphor of two lone figures, standing against the vast, empty prairie, defined by their shared purpose, underscored the emotional depth of the moment. The days that followed were a testament to this new, fragile alliance. Silas, with a quiet efficiency, began to scout the surrounding area, seeking any sign of Elias. Alara, in turn, found herself slowly, reluctantly, opening up, offering details of Elias's character, his methods, his particular brand of cunning. Their dialogue remained sparse, but each word was impactful, laden with subtext, building a bridge of understanding between them. The emotional tone was tense, yet a subtle undercurrent of shared purpose. A nascent hope began to weave through the bleakness. They spoke of the gold, the true origin of it, and the desperate circumstances that had led Alara to acquire it. It was a dark tale, a tapestry of desperation and dubious morality, a further revelation of her deeply flawed past, yet told without self-pity, only a grim, factual recounting. Silas listened, his face impassive, but his eyes held a growing understanding, a silent recognition of the impossible choices often forced upon individuals in such a brutal world. He no longer saw a simple, murderous widow, but a woman forged in a crucible of hardship, navigating a world that offered little mercy. The search for Elias was relentless, a patient, painstaking effort that often felt futile in the vastness of the prairie. They followed faint tracks, interrogated distant homesteaders, pieced together rumors and fleeting glimpses. The tension was a constant companion, a taut wire stretched between them. Every false lead, every dead end, chipped away at their resolve, yet they pressed on, driven by a shared, grim determination. Alara, often accompanying Silas, found herself relearning the land, not just as a place of refuge, but as a hunting ground. Her senses sharpened, her instincts dulled by years of quiet solitude, awakened by the constant threat. She began to anticipate Silas's movements, to read his unspoken thoughts, a subtle camaraderie forming between them in the silence of the chase. Their conversations often turned reflective, not just about the hunt for Elias, but about the nature of survival, the scars that life in the West left on a person's soul. Silas, in turn, shared glimpses of his own past, a life lived on the fringes, making him a complex character, not just a simple stereotype. The pivotal emotional climax loomed, unseen but felt, drawing closer with each passing day. It was not just about finding Elias. It was about confronting the past, about seeking a final definitive closure. The symbolism of the hunt was strong. They were not just tracking a man, but the consequences of her choices, the lingering shadows of a life she had tried to abandon. One evening, As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in a dramatic tableau of blood-red and bruised purple, they found a sign. A discarded campfire, still faintly warm, deeper in a rugged canyon known for its treacherous terrain. Elias was here. The air crackled with anticipation, a palpable tension. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum. This was it, the culmination of her journey, the confrontation she had both dreaded and yearned for. Silas's face was grim, resolute. He looked at Ilara, a silent question in his eyes. She met his gaze, her own burning with a fierce resolve. "We go in," she stated, her voice low, unwavering. No hesitation, no fear, just a cold, hard determination. The dramatic storytelling was reaching its crescendo, bringing the narrative to its inevitable, perilous confrontation. The descent into the canyon was treacherous, a dark, winding path shrouded in shadows. Each step was deliberate, cautious, the silence broken only by the crunch of their boots on loose rock and the distant howl of the wind. The air grew colder, heavier, charged with the palpable tension of their impending confrontation. Ilara's senses were on high alert, her hand instinctively resting on the pistol she now carried. Silas moved ahead, his movements fluid, expert, a silent guardian navigating the treacherous terrain. His presence, once a symbol of her betrayal, was now a source of unexpected strength, a testament to the complex, shifting bonds that could form in the crucible of shared danger. The common devices of suspense and symbolism permeated the air. The canyon walls, steep and unyielding, felt like a metaphor for the inescapable nature of her past, closing in around her. The deepening darkness was a reflection of the grim truth they were about to confront. The path ahead was illuminated only by the faint light of a crescent moon, casting long, distorted shadows that danced and shifted, creating a sense of unease. They found Elias's camp nestled in a small, hidden alcove, a flickering fire casting dancing shadows against the rock face. He sat hunched over it, a solitary, menacing figure, his face illuminated by the dancing flames, etched with a raw, desperate cunning. He was clearly wounded, favoring one arm, a grim reminder of his escape. The sight of him sent a cold wave of dread through Ilara, but also a surge of fierce, unyielding resolve. This was the ghost of her past, the architect of her suffering, the one who had twisted her life into this agonizing knot. This was the final, pivotal, emotional climax. Silas drew his pistol, his movements slow, deliberate, the metallic click echoing loudly in the oppressive quiet. "Elias!" he called out, his voice cutting through the silence with surprising force. Elias's head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise, then narrowed into a feral glare as he saw them. His hand darted for a rifle leaning against the rock, his movement swift despite his injury. "Ilara!" he snarled, his voice hoarse, venomous. "You brought dogs to my door." His eyes burned with a bitter, unrepentant hatred, his words laced with a crude, aggressive subtext, revealing the depth of his villainy. The confrontation was swift, brutal. Elias, desperate and cornered, opened fire, his shots echoing wildly through the canyon. Silas returned fire, his aim precise, grounded in experience. Ilara, though not a fighter in the conventional sense, held her ground, her mind clear, focused. She moved with a calculated precision, her past teaching her to read the subtle shifts in a man's intent. The struggle was short-lived. Elias, already weakened, succumbed to Silas's precise aim. He fell, a crumpled heap by the dying fire, his rifle clattering against the rocks. The silence descended once more, heavy and absolute, broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing and the faint crackle of the embers. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder, a stark testament to the violence that had just unfolded. Ilara stood over Elias's body, her gaze fixed on his still form. There was no triumph, no elation, only a profound, bone-deep weariness. The open loop of her past, the one that had haunted her for so long, was finally, brutally, closed. Silas knelt beside Elias, checking for a pulse, then shook his head grimly. "He's gone." He found the small leather pouch of gold on Elias's person, the very gold that had brought so much devastation. He held it out to Ilara, a silent offering. She took it, the weight of it surprisingly heavy in her palm. a tangible reminder of the complex, morally ambiguous choices that had defined her life. "It always finds its way back, doesn't it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, a reflective statement on the relentless nature of karma and consequence. The resolution, though violent, brought a strange, fragile sense of peace. The dark, tense emotional tone had given way to a quiet, reflective solemnity, punctuated by a flicker of hope. They had faced the past, confronted the shadow, and emerged, not unscathed, but with a clearer path forward. The dramatic storytelling had found its brutal, yet cathartic conclusion. The silence in the canyon was no longer oppressive, but vast and empty, waiting to be filled with the new chapters of her life. The journey from accusation to confrontation, from condemnation to understanding, had finally reached its end. The journey back from the canyon was different. The weight that had pressed down on Alara for so long seemed to have lifted, leaving her feeling profoundly weary, yet strangely unburdened. The vast, indifferent prairie, once a symbol of her isolation and her hidden past, now felt simply like land, a canvas for a new, uncertain future. The silence between her and Silas was no longer filled with suspicion or unspoken tension, but with a quiet understanding, a mutual respect forged in the crucible of shared peril. Their dialogue, still sparse, now carried a deeper resonance, each glance, each shared moment of quiet observation, communicating volumes. They had faced the truth, however brutal, and in doing so, had found a fragile kind of peace. The resolution was not a sudden burst of joy, but a gradual dawning of acceptance, a slow healing of old wounds. Upon their return to the ranch, Sheriff Bowman and his deputies were still present, grim-faced, awaiting their return. When Silas recounted the events in the canyon, showing the recovered gold and describing Elias's last desperate stand, the sheriff's face softened, the last vestiges of doubt melting away. "So it's done," Bowman stated, his voice quiet, almost respectful. He looked at Alara, his gaze holding a newfound understanding. "You're a free woman, ma'am, and I apologize for the trouble we caused." The apology was a rare thing in this harsh land, a testament to the profound shift in perspective her truth had brought. Alara simply nodded, her eyes distant, already looking beyond the immediate aftermath. The societal figures, once quick to judge, now offered a tentative if still guarded respect. Some of the cowboys, their faces now reflecting curiosity rather than condemnation, offered nods of acknowledgement. The resolution was grounded, realistic, reflecting the complexities of frontier justice and the slow process of rebuilding trust and reputation. The deputies eventually left, leaving only Silas behind. He made no move to leave, his presence a quiet, steadfast anchor in her now changed world. He helped her with the ranch chores, his movements steady, his commitment unspoken but clear. The physical work was a solace, a rhythm that helped to ground her in the present, to mend the fragments of her shattered routine. She found herself speaking more freely, sharing details of her life that had long been guarded secrets. She spoke of Thomas, not just of his death but of their life together, the hopes they had shared, the struggles they had endured. The memories, once tinged with regret, now felt clearer, less burdened by the unspoken guilt she had carried. The language style, simple yet richly descriptive, captured the nuanced emotional shifts. The narrative tension, once focused on Elias and the accusation, now pivoted to the quiet, internal struggle of healing and rebuilding. The prairie, which had once felt like an endless, empty void, slowly began to regain its familiar embrace. The wind still moaned, but its lament now carried a different tune, a song of resilience rather than despair. The vastness was no longer threatening, but offered a sense of open possibility, a future unwritten. Alara knew her life would never be truly simple or entirely free of shadows. The past, however buried, would always leave its subtle marks, but she was no longer alone, not in the profound, isolating way she had been. Silas was there, a silent companion, a quiet support. Their bond was not one of romance, but of a shared history, a mutual respect born from surviving a storm together. The symbolism was evident. The harsh land that had tested her now offered a fragile space for renewal. The final emotional tone was one of hope, a subtle yet profound hope, not for a perfect future, but for a future where she could finally breathe, where the weight of her secrets no longer crushed her spirit. She stood on her porch one evening, watching the last sliver of sun disappear below the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of lavender and gold. The quiet hum of the prairie surrounded her, no longer a warning but a lullaby. The story of the widow who fed 3 stranded cowboys and the storm it brought had ended. But the story of Alara, a woman deeply flawed yet unyielding, had finally found its true beginning. The linear narrative had reached its resolution, leaving behind a profound sense of closure and the quiet promise of a new chapter.